Scams and Folktales, the podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, and this is our Cellini episode for the month. In this episode, Cellini gives birth to his masterpiece, the bronze Perseus. It almost kills him, and I'd argue that if it's because he's a Viditus Magus, his process draws on his life energy, so that he is in risk of death to get this final piece of work done. I would note, because this is Cellini, at the very end, his enemies suggest that no human being could possibly have created something as wonderful as what he's created, and therefore he must be a demon. I'd link this into the Paganini story. He was such a good player of the violin that he must have been trained by a demon. And to one of our far earlier episodes, The Self-Made Man is a Monster. The following was recorded into the public domain by Sue Anderson through LibriVox. Thanks very much, Sue. Thanks to Sue's production team. This is our second last Cellini. The last one, which will be next month, has me going through the work, plucking out weird bits of medical alchemy. You'd be amazed how Cellini removes iron splinters from his eyes.
Accordingly, I strengthened my heart, and with all the forces of my body and my purse, employing what little money still remained to me, I set to work. First, I provided myself with several loads of pine wood from the forests of Serristori, in the neighborhood of Montelupo. While these were on their way, I clothed my Perseus with the clay which I had prepared many months beforehand, in order that it might be duly seasoned. After making its clay tunic, for that is the term used in this art, and properly arming it and fencing it with iron girders, I began to draw the wax out by means of a slow fire. This melted and issued through numerous air vents I had made, for the more there are of these, the better will the mold fill. When I had finished drawing off the wax, I constructed a funnel-shaped furnace all around the model of my Perseus. It was built of bricks, so interlaced the one above the other that numerous apertures were left for the fire to exhale at. Then I began to lay on wood by degrees, and kept it burning 2 whole days and nights. At length, when all the wax was gone, and the mold was well baked, I set to work at digging the pit in which to sink it. This I performed with scrupulous regard to all the rules of art. When I had finished that part of my work, I raised the mold, by windlasses and stout ropes, to a perpendicular position, and suspending it with the greatest care 1 cubit above the level of the furnace, so that it hung exactly above the middle of the pit, I next lowered it gently down into the very bottom of the furnace, and had it firmly placed with every possible precaution for its safety. When this delicate operation was accomplished, I began to bank it up with the earth I had excavated, and ever as the earth grew higher, I introduced its proper air vents, which were little tubes of earthenware such as folk use for drains and such like purposes. At length I felt sure that it was admirably fixed, and that the filling in of the pit and the placing of the air vents had been properly performed. I also could see that my workpeople understood my method, which differed very considerably from that of all the other masters in the trade. Feeling confident then that I could rely upon them, I next turned to my furnace, which I had filled with numerous pigs of copper and other bronze stuff. The pieces were piled according to the laws of art, that is to say, resting one upon the other that the flames could play freely through them, in order that the metal might heat and liquefy the sooner. At last I called out heartily to set the furnace going. The logs of pine were heaped in, and what with the unctuous resin of the wood and the good draught I had given, my furnace worked so well that I was obliged to rush from side to side to keep it going. The labor was more than I could stand, yet I forced myself to strain every nerve and muscle. To increase my anxieties, the workshop took fire, and we were afraid lest the roof should fall upon our heads, while from the garden such a storm of wind and rain kept blowing in, that it perceptibly cooled the furnace. Battling thus with all these untoward circumstances for several hours, and exerting myself beyond even the measure of my powerful constitution, I could at last bear up no longer, and a sudden fever, of the utmost possible intensity, attacked me. I felt absolutely obliged to go and fling myself upon my bed. Sorely against my will, having to drag myself away from the spot, I turned to my assistants, about 10 or more in all, what with master founders, hand workers, country fellows, and my own special journeyman, among whom was Bernardino Manalini of Mugello, my apprentice through several years. To him in particular I spoke: "Look, my dear Bernardino, that you observe the rules which I have taught you. Do your best with all dispatch, for the metal will soon be fused. You cannot go wrong. These honest men will get the channels ready. You will easily be able to drive back the 2 plugs with this pair of iron crooks, and I am sure that my mold will fill miraculously. I feel more ill than I ever did in all my life, and verily believe that it will kill me before a few hours are over." Thus, with despair at heart, I left them and betook myself to bed. Chapter 76. No sooner had I got to bed than I ordered my serving maids to carry food and wine for all the men into the workshop. At the same time I cried, "I shall not be alive tomorrow." They tried to encourage me, arguing that my illness would pass over, since it came from excessive fatigue. In this way I spent 2 hours battling with the fever, which steadily increased, and calling out continually, "I feel that I am dying." My housekeeper, who was named Montefiore da Castel del Rio, a very notable manager and no less warm-hearted, kept chiding me for my discouragement. But on the other hand she paid me every kind attention which was possible. However, the sight of my physical pain and moral dejection so affected her that, in spite of that brave heart of hers, she could not refrain from shedding tears, and yet, so far as she was able, she took good care I should not see them. While I was thus terribly afflicted, I beheld the figure of a man enter my chamber, twisted in his body into the form of a capital S. He raised a lamentable, doleful voice, like one who announces their last hour to men condemned to die upon the scaffold, and spoke these words: "Oh, Benvenuto, your statue is spoiled, and there is no hope whatever of saving it." No sooner had I heard the shriek of that wretch than I gave a howl which might have been heard from the sphere of flame. Jumping from my bed, I seized my clothes and began to dress. The maids and my lads and everyone who came around to help me got kicks or blows of the fist, while I kept crying out in lamentation, "Ah, traitors, enviers, this is an act of treason done by malice prepense. But I swear by God that I will sift it to the bottom, and before I die will leave such witness to the world of what I can do as shall make a score of mortals marvel." When I had got my clothes on, I strode with soul bent on mischief toward the workshop. There I beheld the men whom I had left erewhile in such high spirits, standing stupefied and downcast. I began at once and spoke: "Up with you, attend to me. Since you have not been able or willing to obey the directions I gave you, obey me now, that I am with you to conduct my work in person. Let no one contradict me, for in cases like this we need the aid of hand and hearing, not of advice." When I had uttered these words, a certain maestro, Alessandro Lastricati, broke silence and said: "Look you, Benvenuto, you are going to attempt an enterprise which the laws of art do not sanction, and which cannot succeed." I turned upon him with such fury and so full of mischief that he and all the rest of them exclaimed with one voice: "On then, give orders. We will obey your least commands, so long as life is left in us." I believe they spoke thus feelingly because they thought I must fall shortly dead upon the ground. I went immediately to inspect the furnace, and found that the metal was all curdled, an accident which we express by being caked. I told two of the hands to cross the road and fetch from the house of the butcher Capretta a load of young oak wood which had lain dry for above a year. This wood had been previously offered me by Madame Ginevra, wife of the said Capretta. So soon as the first armfuls arrived, I began to fill the grate beneath the furnace. Now, oak wood of that kind heats more powerfully than any other sort of tree, and for this reason, where a slow fire is wanted, as in the case of gun foundry, alder or pine is preferred. Accordingly, when the logs took fire, oh, how the cake began to stir beneath that awful heat, to glow and sparkle in a blaze. At the same time I kept stirring up the channels, and sent men upon the roof to stop the conflagration which had gathered force from the increased combustion in the furnace. Also I caused boards, carpets, and other hangings to be set up against the garden, in order to protect us from the violence of the rain. Chapter 77. When I had thus provided against these several disasters, I roared out first to one man and then to another, "Bring this thing here, take that thing there." At this crisis, when the whole gang saw the cake was on the point of melting, they did my bidding, each fellow working with the strength of 3. I then ordered half a pig of pewter to be brought, which weighed about 60 pounds, and flung it into the middle of the cake inside the furnace. By this means, and by piling on wood and stirring, now with pokers and now with iron rods, the curdled mass rapidly began to liquefy. Then, knowing I had brought the dead to life again, against the firm opinion of those ignoramuses, I felt such vigor fill my veins that all those pains of fever, all those fears of death, were quite forgotten. All of a sudden an explosion took place, attended by a tremendous flash of flame, as though a thunderbolt had formed and been discharged amongst us. Unwonted and appalling terror astonished everyone, and me more even than the rest. When the din was over and the dazzling light extinguished, we began to look each other in the face. Then I discovered that the cap of the furnace had blown up, and the bronze was bubbling over from its source beneath. So I had the mouths of my mold immediately opened, and at the same time drove in the 2 plugs which kept back the molten metal. But I noticed that it did not flow as rapidly as usual, the reason being probably that the fierce heat of the fire we kindled had consumed its base alloy. Accordingly I sent for all my pewter platters, porringers, and dishes, to the number of some 200 pieces, and had a portion of them cast, one by one, into the channels, the rest into the furnace. This expedient succeeded, and everyone could now perceive that my bronze was in most perfect liquefaction, and my mold was filling. Whereupon they all, with heartiness and happy cheer, assisted and obeyed my bidding, while I, now here, now there, helped with my own hands, and cried aloud, "O God, Thou that by Thy immeasurable power didst rise from the dead, and in Thy glory didst ascend to heaven." Even thus in a moment my mold was filled, and seeing my work finished, I fell upon my knees, and with all my heart gave thanks to God. After all was over, I turned to a plate of salad on a bench there, and ate with hearty appetite, and drank together with the whole crew. Afterwards I retired to bed, healthy and happy, for it was now 2 hours before morning, and slept as sweetly as though I had never felt a touch of illness. My good housekeeper, without my giving any orders, had prepared a fat capon for my repast, so that when I rose about the hour for breaking fast, she presented herself with a smiling countenance and said, "Oh, is that the man who felt he was dying? Upon my word, I think the blows and kicks you dealt us last night, when you were so enraged and had that demon in your body as it seemed, must have frightened away your mortal fever. The fever feared that it might catch it too, as we did. All my poor household, relieved in like measure from anxiety and overwhelming labor, went at once to buy earthen vessels, in order to replace the pewter I had cast away. Then we dined together joyfully. Nay, I cannot remember a day in my whole life when I dined with greater gladness or a better appetite. After our meal I received visits from the several men who had assisted me. They exchanged congratulations and thanked God for our success, saying they had learned and seen things done which other masters judged impossible. I too grew somewhat glorious, and deeming I had shown myself a man of talent, indulged a boastful humor. So I thrust my hand into my purse and paid them all to their full satisfaction. That evil fellow, my mortal foe, Monsieur Pier Francesco Ricci, major domo of the Duke, took great pains to find out how the affair had gone. In answer to his questions, the two men whom I suspected of having caked my medal for me said I was no man, but of a certainty some powerful devil, since I had accomplished what no craft of the art could do. Indeed, they did not believe a mere ordinary fiend could work such miracles as I, in other ways, had shown. They exaggerated the whole affair so much, possibly in order to excuse their own part in it, that the major domo wrote an account to the Duke, who was then in Pisa, far more marvelous and full of thrilling incidents than what they had narrated.
Your saga may vary.